right, welcome to another episode of Culture Deconstructed. Today it is Stefan Bertram Lee, Djene Bajalan, and Aflie Bound, along with your host, Douglas Lane. On the stream, we are on Twitch right now. We have no viewers at all, so we can say whatever we like. But this episode of Culture Deconstructed is going to be about Star Trek. And when we say that, we mean the real Star Trek, the original series of Star Trek. And we're going to be talking about two episodes, I suppose, but one primarily. And that is, as hipsters, we're going to be talking about the pilot episode of Star Trek called The Cage, where there was no Kirk. Jeffrey Hunter played Captain Pike. And it was never aired, or at least not originally, and as part of the original series. The network didn't pick it up after the first pilot. They said it was too cerebral, and they went back to the drawing board and changed the show around, hired a different captain. Although the real truth of that is that Jeffrey Hunter, who played Captain Pike, decided to quit and focus on his movie career instead.
Focus on dying.
Well, he did die. But that was not his.
He comes back in another episode. And he's in a kind of Davros-style wheelie chair, and he's speaking with his beeper.
I don't think that's Jeffrey Hunter. I think that's why he's in a...
No, but that's the character.
That's Captain Pike, yeah.
Captain Pike comes back.
I feel like I should say, before anyone gets into it, that I have never seen Star Trek until today. So I'm here as this.
Wow. You've not seen like some episodes on like Sky or whatever.
I mean, I have some memories of being a child and it being on. My dad watching it, but So you guys seemingly Trekkies, and I'm here as a sort of. I watched these two episodes today for the first time, fresh, and I have a lot of good things to say, but I feel like this is quite unusual. It's like somebody who's never watched. I don't know.
I'm not a Trekkie at all, so it's 2-2 today on the live.
Well, I'm not like a big fan of the original series. I've seen the original series. I think there's good ideas in the original series, but I think it's like one of those things that's pretty dated now and can be a little difficult to watch.
Well, I loved it.
I'll let you come back.
It's not terrible. It's a bit dated to watch. It's a bit dated, and also, I mean, obviously for Doug, that's the TV of his 40s, right? So
when he was a youthful 106.
Yeah.
But I can totally see that people, when it first came out in the 1960s, it blew people's minds. Like sometimes you see something and you watch it and you're like, what was the big fuss about? But then you're like, oh yeah, of course. Like Alien, when it came out in 1979, there was like never been anything like Alien. So people totally lost their minds over that movie. You go down 20 years later, those things have become tropes. So when you see the original, you don't actually kind of contemplate like the big sort of cultural impact.
I didn't expect the first episode of Star Trek to be about everything being like an illusion and stuff.
Yeah, right.
Well, okay, all right.
It's very 60s.
You're wrong about two things here, Djene. The first is that Star Trek, when it originally came out, did not blow people's minds. In fact, it was not a highly rated show. And people had seen things that were similar to it before, particularly Lost in Space, which had been on a year earlier. 1965 is when that show began. And there are other science fiction programs, I think, even before that. There's also, what you'd see in the 50s in the movies, which was similar. I think Star Trek and Forbidden Planet share a lot in common in terms of like the overall universe and the structure of the Federation, for instance, and just sort of the vision of space exploration is similar in those, like from Forbidden Planet to Star Trek. So what's weird, what we have to ask ourselves is like, why did Star Trek become the franchise it became? What made it survive into the 70s, it only was on for 3 seasons. It was cut short in its 3rd season. If you watch the original 3 seasons, it's clear that the show gets worse as it goes along.
Because I was going to try and watch the first episode because I was wondering what the budget of the pilot was, because the visuals, I mean, they're
awesome. Like when that Birdman in the next like the costumes that they had. But... Yeah.
I mean, for someone who saw this for the first time today, I mean, answer your question, Doug, I felt it was really of contemporary relevance, like the way in which this is actually I mean, my interpretation of episode 0 and 1 is that this is actually about masculinity and the relationship between technology and masculinity, and how do machines and women relate to each other. You've got these lads talking about their relationships, but then you've got this idea of the machine that fulfills desires and can do everything. And what struck me as a first ever Star Trek watcher today was that, I mean, it's clear to see why this would have survived, and it's embarrassing that we haven't actually been able to move things on from there, because this is basically what sci-fi is today.
Yeah. Well, okay, and the better sci-fi. So I don't know, the someone who spent way too much time on Star Trek. Like the other day, I was sitting around the dinner table with my son and my roommate Jim, and we had a trivia contest where Noah read the titles of every episode in the 3rd season, and I had to give a plot synopsis of them, and Jim had to give a plot synopsis. And Jim would go first, and he inevitably or invariably would just make stuff up, because he didn't know. He had no idea. And it was pretty entertaining to hear what he came up with for each title. But I knew them, like almost all of them. Like it was more than 90% I could get. And when I was a teenager, like I spent time reading the little encyclopedia of Star Trek, playing Star Trek trivia. I sent a friend. I didn't go, but I sent a friend to a Star Trek convention, and he came back with a schematic of the Enterprise for me, and a poster of Captain Kirk with his shirt ripped open that I put on my wall.
Did Kirk inspire you to be a sci-fi author? Would you say Star Trek?
I would not. Well, not consciously. Like I would never want to claim that, but perhaps the whatever it was that I loved about that made me love Star Trek is why I ended up writing science fiction. Maybe it's the same thing. Yeah, but I know especially the original series really well, like because that was what was on when I was a teenager. And I mean, when the new one came out, I didn't watch it for 2 or 3 years because I was like, oh, it doesn't have Kirk and Spock. Fuck this shit. I'm not going to watch the next Star Trek. But anyway, what were you going to ask, Alfie?
I was just going to ask whether I thought Gene's question was interesting, like you saying, no, I wouldn't want to admit that Star Trek was part of my sci-fi novelist. But also, when you look back now, like, I don't know what series it's in, but like, I want to know what you think, Doug, as someone who watched that first series. Wait, at the time? Did you watch it at the time it was coming out?
No. I wasn't born yet when it came out originally. I was born after Star Trek went off the air. 1966.
66. Bloody hell. Well, it is
really
good.
old, yeah.
Oh. But yeah, I mean, I suppose the thing I was trying to drive at is like how does, because I came to it today obviously fresh, having never watched it, but like knowing this kind of like whole subculture around it, like what explains that? I think that's what we need to get into, really, like, because to me,
it's interesting you talked about masculinity, because obviously Star Trek was the first, it's where the term comes from, of slash fiction.
That is true. That happened like not obviously right off the bat, but in the 70s.
Like before they had the internet, people would like mail around like Star Trek homosexual romance fan fiction, like on mailing lists.
Yeah, Kirk and Spock.
Yeah.
So Star Trek is part of a sort of prehistory of the internet in a way, where community building and subcultural community building was going on around this before what is now commonplace to us. That's pretty important.
There were fanzines back then. So amateur magazines created by fans to celebrate their favorite shows, and Star Trek was like the ultimate example. it was one of the first shows that started having conventions for fans, and there were fan scenes where they would debate the finer points of the episodes and how the technology worked, and write homoerotic stories about Kirk and Spock, and all sorts of stuff.
It was in syndication on TV.
It was yes.
It was like heavily in syndication throughout the 70s and 80s, and then you also had, because its popularity. I mean, I would probably push back a little bit on the idea that Star Wars was not like a next step from pre-existing science fiction that had been on television.
We're talking about Star Trek, not Star Wars. You said Star Wars and
Star Trek. Sorry,
Star Trek.
Wrong one.
Gene commits the biggest faux pas in history.
Again, I'm sorry, but goodbye. Okay, all right. Come, you can come back. Go ahead.
There were good sci-fi shows before. You had the pulp sci-fi on TV, but you had things like The Outer Limits and what's the other one? The one with the door.
Twilight Zone.
The Twilight Zone, where you had like these anthology shows which were popular, and then you had these shows like Lost in Space, which was kind of like a family show, like a very family-oriented show. It was like, I believe it was like sold as Robinson Crusoe in space. But Star Trek was this sitcom which vacillated between high sci-fi ideas and, a Western, which was like explicitly how it was being
Wagon Train in Space.
Wagon Train in Space. But it was, it was trying to do a lot of that high-end, like deep thinking sci-fi. Because if you watch stuff like the Twilight Zone, and the Outer Limits, those shows, like, they have like interesting discussions, interesting like real sci-fi ideas. Like they really kind of hit the genre very well. And Star Trek.
Star Trek. You almost did it again, but it almost corrected yourself into a mistake.
Into the wrong answer. Yeah, Star Trek is somehow a synthesis between that high sci-fi concept model that you see in the anthology shows, and then the kind of in space sitcom, in space like serialized show as well. And I think that was quite innovative for its time. So it's not like it isn't created out of nothing, but it does. It's a kind of synthesis of these two types of sci-fi show, the lowbrow and the highbrow, which makes it accessible. And perhaps it was just a little bit ahead of its time. And really it just hits big because it may be ahead of its time, but it's still in syndication when the audience that is truly receptive to it starts watching TV. And you have this huge revival. There's the animated series comes along as well, which again brings back bizarrely some of that high sci-fi concept stuff. And then the first movie, which I think is 79, which again which is unlike the second movie, which is everybody says is the best one, the Wrath of Khan. The first one is another like high concept sci-fi, whereas the second one is a kind of Wild West revenge story. So like it combined these two types of show, and I think Star Trek has become a gold standard or a model of how to do a sci-fi show going forward. You're either trying to do the Star Wars or you're trying to do the Star Trek, but it's one or the other. For the last 50 years, we have these two genres, which weren't obviously didn't come from nowhere. They had precursors. They themselves purloined ideas from a lot of different sources, but they became the gold standards of the so-called the more cerebral hard science fiction TV show. Although I don't know if we would say Star Trek is really hard science fiction. And then the kind of just space opera. It could be in a fantasy world. It could be in any setting, but it's basically the backdrop.
If I was marking your essay, Gene, I'd say it had a lot of zoomed out historical generalizations in, but didn't have enough close reading of the episodes themselves. I think we need to drill deeper into the actual.
Well, I think
I was going to say that Dan was talking about it being ahead of its time, and it was very interesting in the episode how he says, like, when the woman comes to deliver the report in the pilot about, like, oh, I'm not used to women being on the bridge, and then he's talking to the woman on the bridge, and then 5 minutes later he leaves her in charge of everything. So that was quite funny. That kind of, it's like, oh, I'm not used to women on the bridge, but you're the captain now, and you're in charge for the rest of the episode. I'm going to fuck off and get captured, and you can spend the whole time trying to rescue me.
Right.
Which I don't think was particularly usual at the time to have a TV show where a woman is left in charge of like a military unit. Though they're only semi-military unit, right? But anyway, I still think I assume it's very unusual at the time.
Well, Gene Roddenberry, was an interesting guy, and the woman who was put in charge, who was number one in the first episode of The Cage there, which, by the way, she did not remain as the second in command in the actual series. That is not the case.
By the way,
instead you get the only female on the bridge is the secretary who's taking calls, the communications officer. But but she is black, so there's that. But what Gene really wanted to do with that role was find a position on the show for his mistress at the time.
Oh yeah, he was like, oh.
Yeah. So and the network did not like the stories about what happened there are, it's a he said, she said kind of thing, but the network didn't like her as an actress, and people resented him putting his girlfriend on the show in that position. And
I don't think she was very good at acting. She was quite boring.
Yeah, and
right. She did come back though. She was in the series.
Yeah, she was Nurse Chapel, but not. And it took a while.
And not only that, she was in Deep Space Nine. She was Deanna Troy's mother.
Yeah, she was the voice of the computer for everything. Yeah, for from Star Trek, The Next Generation on, she was the voice of the computer. But in any case, the mix there is, I think Gene wanted to have it both ways. He wanted to like bring the sexy yeoman on the bridge and make a point of it, and how uncomfortable it made the captain, not because he didn't want a woman in charge, because he didn't think women could be in charge, but because he didn't want to get horny on the bridge.
Yeah, because the division seems to be he wants to fuck the human, but not the second in command.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Which also makes you think of what, like, both of the women in the show that are meant to be the very beautiful, attractive women in the episode are, it felt very much from a different era, because they were very annoying. They had this very strange voice, which is presumably affected. And I don't know, I guess that's something that just was a bit alien to me, that these were meant to be like really hot, beautiful, attractive women.
I totally agree with that, Stefan. And I don't know exactly who our audience is. Maybe they are all Trekkies who have got the sense of what Doug and Gene are saying about the whole history of this fucking franchise. But, what struck me on watching these first ever 2 episodes of Star Trek was like 2 things. Firstly, like just how much it was about this kind of weird relationship between men and women, and I found that really strange. And the way in which the women, and I don't mean this in a sort of things were problematic in the old days kind of way. I actually thought the opposite. I thought that the sort of sensitivity towards the question of gender in the first 2 episodes of Star Trek was arguably better than we see in the average TV show today. And but there were these kind of like weird kind of masculine jokes about whether the machine would be fulfilling. My favorite was this kind of quote where in episode 2, I think it's called The Man Trap, which I suggest we all are in, where the guy is describing this machine, and he's sort of doing a sort of you know, like checking someone's tonsils to see if they've got tonsillitis or something, like a general health check. And he says, doesn't the machine like do these things for you as well as like all the sexual things? And he says, the machine can do almost anything, but I still put my trust in the health of in the healthy set of tonsils. And it's like kind of like men saying like, I'd rather have a blowjob from a human than a robot. Basically, it's my interpretation of that. And,
so when was the holodeck? When was the holodeck introduced?
So the holodeck,
that was the second series, is Next Generation. They didn't have holodeck.
No, Doug, you're wrong. It's from the animated series. The holodeck is from the animated series.
Yeah, okay.
Is that canon? Basically, they're getting the guy's getting tortured inside like a holodeck, basically. And I presume
that's what it is. I mean, that first episode, that's what I mean by high sci-fi. Like Doug pointed out at the beginning, they didn't pick up the show because it was too highbrow, and they had to like lowbrow it a bit in order to get it picked up. But that first episode is really trying to, it's kind of like Matrixy in a sense, and like what is reality, and it's a theme that Star Trek comes back to over and over again. And in fact, the Star Trek Generations movie, the one where they have Picard and Kirk together, that is all about, Kirk being in a similar kind of situation where it's not real, but so does it even matter? So this is, this was like a highbrow episode. I think Alfie's right. There's the whole gender dynamic, like the different tropes of women. They send the kind of innocent virginal wife, and then they send the green whore, but does it? So you have that aspect, and then you have this whole question of reality, and does it really matter if it's fake or not? And I think that's kind of an interesting idea that we are kind of still discussing. I mean, you guys talked about the Matrix movie, right? Which is retreading something Star Trek retreaded in like 1965?
It's funny that new Matrix film, I don't think at any point actually asked, does it matter if it's real or not?
Right. Yeah, the first Matrix did ask that.
Yeah, with the villainous guy.
But this is exactly what I think. I mean, in a very quick nutshell, this is what, as a person who watched Star Trek for the first time today, that this was my most strong instinct to say that, well, this is still what we're thinking about.
Yeah. This is what one of the things I want to point out is I think the original pilot does set the template for most, at least of the original series and even the Next Generation, where what we're looking at is something like a little bit like Gulliver's Travels. We're looking at a group of people going from planet to planet, and on each planet, I mean, this isn't universally the case, but some of the more memorable episodes are they go to a planet, they discover what's wrong with the planet, with the civilization that's there, and they either intervene to change it or they escape from it. Those are the two.
I mean, and this becomes like a classic kind of sci-fi setup, because this is, I know you guys haven't watched it, but this is the setup for Stargate SG-1, where basically every episode they do a similar thing. And it's funny also, both in Star Trek and Stargate SG-1, is it always has this problem of every planet is a village.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's like one village. I mean, I've seen Stargate. I've seen the first season, but I kind of lost interest. But one of the interesting things I would say about Star Trek, especially the original series, this is before like people got obsessed with canon and continuity and all those kind of things. So, one episode they'd be doing some time travel. They would go to like 1930s Chicago planet. They would go to like Roman planet.
That was not time travel.
That wasn't time travel, but they do go.
They do have some. I just want to point out they did not travel back in time. They did go to the 1930s mafia planet, anyhow, go ahead. There was also a Nazi planet, which was also not time travel.
Wait, that wasn't time travel though.
No, it wasn't. It's not. It was.
And
not.
There's the Greek gods planet as well, which was where all the Greek.
Yeah. but the really great episode with the Greek gods.
And they tried to create a spin-off series as well. I think there was like there was a time travel episode where they went back to Earth in the 60s to stop some nuclear war or something. I can't remember. But you know there isn't really.
But Terry Garr was in that one. Terry Garr was in that one.
Who was in that one?
Terry Garr.
Oh,
the actress Terry Garr from Close Encounters and frequent guest of this is I'm showing my age because you guys don't even know who she is, but she was
I've got no idea.
but
frequent guest on David Letterman. She was in Dumb and Dumber.
Oh, really?
Terry Garr. Yeah.
Well, there you go. That's
she
also
was a
showing
hot young thing at the time when she was on.
But Stefan, can you say a bit more what you were just saying?
About
I thought there was something. Well, you were just. Yeah, I thought you were onto something with this question, like, you know, I don't. Oh no, I don't really. I thought there was something.
I want to quickly finish my point though. My point was there was no like attempt to create a canon or have some kind of continuity. So they were in a certain way liberated to tell the stories that they wanted to tell within the context that they wanted to tell. They weren't like, oh no, if I tell this story, that's going to like clash with the continuity. So you had a similar set of characters, you had a similar setup, but they were in a kind of real meta sense. They were in like a different universe every episode. And Star Trek to a certain degree suffered.
At some point, isn't it?
Huh?
It becomes tiresome at some point, right? That kind of setup.
Yeah, I guess so. But also it creates problems in the future because suddenly they've created this really wacky timeline that they had in the 90s. They're like, oh well, we need to have like some kind of consistent, like canonic universe as well, which is kind of like an interesting development. It's a show that began before people became obsessed with canon. And then it's a show that like survives to that thing and now completely suffers under the dead weight of like fans going, well, that wasn't the correct Enterprise, like
the dead weight of 1,000 generations of nerds.
Yeah, nerds. Like, wow, actually, if you go back to this episode, blah, blah, blah. But so it's like it was a show where like there was just no conception of that because it was coming out of that anthology tradition where you told like different stories in an episodic manner. And that was continued in Next Generation, but there has been a shift towards serialization in Star Trek, and now it's like totally a serialized. The new series are just completely serialized TV shows, which I think takes a little bit away. I mean, I like a little bit of serialization, but they seem to have gone too far in that direction.
I mean, what Stargate SG-1 did was kind of basically like the first couple episodes of the show in a season would be related to the general overall plot, and then the middle would kind of just be kind of adventure stuff, and then kind of the main plot would return in the final few episodes. So it felt like you were moving forward and getting somewhere while also allowing this kind of stuff to happen.
Yeah.
So I'm downloading pictures of Terry Garr to show you guys.
I'm sure people were doing that when you could just first download pictures.
By the way, I think Dumb and Dumber came out before Stefan was born.
This is Terry Garr. Oh, really? Goddamn. This is Terry Garr in the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind with Richard Dreyfuss there. Remember that one about the aliens? And then here she is on Star Trek. I have one other one I will show you in a moment. But anyway, so she was famous. She was a big movie star. She was in Mr. Mom with Michael Keaton. Remember that? Do you guys remember Mr. Mom? You ever seen Mr. Mom? No, of course not. Oh my God. Okay. Anyhow, wait, I'll show you that one. Here she is in Mr. Mom, and then we'll move on. See, what happened in Mr. Mom is that Michael Keaton loses his job. And so Terry Garr has to go back to work, and he stays at home and takes care of the kids. And it's filled with wacky hijinks.
I thought it was going to be like a body swap thing.
No, that would be good too. All right. So what I want to say is let's maybe dive into the cage and say that it is to say that it is too cerebral, might overstate the case, but it was for the networks. But it definitely has a lot of interesting things going on in it, and I think Alfie's correct that you can certainly look at it in terms of its commentary on, maybe unconscious commentary on gender and sexuality and feminism. One of the moments I wanted to talk about from that episode came early on, when they had first beamed down to the planet and were discovering the so-called survivors of the crashed spaceship that had been living there for years, apparently. And so they encounter the survivors, these old men living amongst the wreckage of their ship and in a little makeshift village. And then Vina, the female lead, who becomes a love interest of Captain Pike, emerges from the background, and everybody who's part of the landing party, all the men in the landing party, like stop talking to the old men and turn to look at her. And then the camera pans over to her, and then the camera cuts back to Pike, who is looking at her. And I thought of Laura Mulvey. I think that's how you say her name, or Laura Mulvey. Yeah, who wrote about the male gaze. And in her essay, she argues that Hollywood films overcome difficulties in filmmaking that arise because, you have a camera that's taking multiple shots from all different spaces, and you want to give the viewer the sense that they are engaged in a real space, and that they're, and also obscure the fact that they're not actually active participants in the scene, that they're voyeurs. So you want to create a sense of a continuous space, obscure the fact that they're really looking at what the camera picks up, and get them to identify with the figures on the screen. And Mulvey says that this is done by trying to get the audience to identify with the male protagonist in his scopophilic appreciation and enjoyment of the female object in the movie. And you can see that happening very clearly in that scene where Vina emerges and all the men turn to look at her, and then the camera turns to look at her, and then the camera cuts back to Pike. However, that is subverted because then you have another reverse shot, and we pull back from the screen where Pike's face is being shown, and the aliens are watching him. And now we're like forced into to kind of accepting that we're watching television in one moment, and also who are we meant to identify with now? Yeah, Pike, or
also the woman at that point has like spoken about Pike as if he's an object. Is when he says he's like, I forget what she said exactly. I was going to say
she says he's a fine, healthy specimen, is what she calls him.
Yeah. I would certainly go.
And I want his sperm. I think she almost said that. Not quite, but yeah.
I would certainly go with the second part of your interpretation there, Doug, because I think that this is not a good example of Mulvey's male gaze. In that the shots of women in cinematographic terms, or whatever, are extremely weird. In the second episodes, which I sort of watched more closely, there's this amazing shot where a woman has kind of killed one of the guys, and she's on screen with like her head not part of it and her feet not part of it. It's just like the body across screen. It's an extremely interesting shot, and I would say that my impression was, I also thought about these kind of your first year university type lessons about Laura Mulvey and the male gaze, but my instinct was to say that this is quite subversive in that regard, and does not, they're mocking masculinity and saying, some of these conversations between men is matched by the cinematography of those scenes. And I think, although obviously shot on the most ridiculously low budget now, silly looking scenes, there's actually some really, really interesting cinematography in the pilots and the first episode of the first Star Trek, which is quite subversive, I think, and not really confrontational. And don't forget that that's before Laura Mulvey wrote all that stuff.
Right, that's true. I I don't know. I think we have to be careful about whether or not they're mocking masculinity or whether or not their views are so dated that they
The camera
seem like
mocks it.
the camera mocks it. Okay.
The camera
okay.
mocks it. Yeah.
The author's dead.
Yeah.
Djene, what are you thinking?
I don't know. I mean, the women are definitely presented, like the way that they're filmed seems to be pretty much in line with the times, except one of them's painted green. I mean, I'm
no,
not
the same woman is painted green.
Yeah,
You
it's the same
know,
one.
she appears in multiple guises to seduce him.
Yeah,
I
so
like
she's
when she's
green.
a princess.
So I mean, I think it is. I think definitely there is a subversive sort of element to the story, but perhaps the cinematography doesn't necessarily intentionally reflect that, because people film things in the way that they're used to filming things, even if the intention of filming them is to be subversive. Like you use the tools that you have in order to tell the story, and the people filming are not necessarily the same people who are writing these stories as well.
Well, in the Cage, which again I just watched again, and actually had intended at one point to write about extensively for a book I was going to publish with Zero Books, but never did. Called
Zero what?
right. I was going to be entitled "Star Trek is the True Religion." I think was my first working title, and then anyway, I want to ask the question, like, what do you think the critique of how do you think the critique of society that is in the Cage functions alongside its exploration of gender dynamics? The critique of society is, you don't want a society where the physical side of life, the challenging aspect of life, the visceral part of life is put aside in favor of the cerebral, the philosophical, the interior, the imaginary, and that the risk to an advanced civilization where consciousness had been fully developed would be that we would become sedentary and navel gazing and not particularly masculine.
Did you say in the chat, or did I misread, that the aliens were meant to be women?
They weren't meant to be. They were. They were actresses.
Really?
Playing those parts. Yeah. They were meant to be. Yeah, they were meant to be men. They were meant to be taken as masculine, but they were in fact women.
Well, it's the Khaldunian cycle, and which is the the notion that the vigorous forces of changing history come out of tough conditions, and the people who live on the borders of civilization in barbarism, and that barbarism drives them to have a strong group consciousness, excel, and then conquer the soft, decadent urban centers of civilization where the people are being reduced to nothing more than sheep, protected by their walls and their paid-for guards. And then eventually, of course, in the cycle, those conquerors who come from the margins of civilization, are seduced by within 3 generations are seduced, and their hegemony breaks down and a new group arises. I mean, and of course, there are iterations of this notion of cyclical history, or the notion of urban decadence versus, the purity of, the periphery that go on for ages, that exist in different contexts and in different times and in different civilizations. And I think certainly one of the things, and I think this isn't just Star Trek, and this isn't just The Cage, I think there is a kind of almost subconscious fear in Western civilization that they've descended into this decadent phase of degeneracy, and that makes the civilization vulnerable. So this trope about this advanced decadent civilization, I think that's something that pops up in Western culture quite a lot, and in sci-fi as well. So that's how I take these things, that these civilizations become just lethargic because
I mean,
there's nothing.
it's not exactly that, right? Because I guess there's two different things. One of which is kind of like when your civilization becomes decadent and becomes like hedonistic and then lives in the moment. But what's shown in this episode is not a society living in the moment, but a society living in the past, right? That they're constantly reflecting on these old memories, and it's like a similar thing. It's like another form of this kind of decadence where your civilization goes on too long, declines, and then you just end up in completely frozen, like looking backwardsness.
And now I want to show you another picture of Terry Garr when she was young. See, look at it. It's beautiful. Beautiful woman. You should know who she
looks
is.
a lot nicer than she did in Star Trek. In Star Trek, which they gave her terrible hair. Look at that hair. What the fuck? She looks like
That's banging hair. That's good hair. That's a solid solid cut.
Terry Garr. Everyone should know who she is. Okay, all right, go ahead, Alfie.
I've got. I don't know if I can do this by sharing, but I've got the image I was talking about that I thought was quite subversive example.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So see if you can. I don't know if you can share the screen or not. If you email it to me, I'll put it up.
You can share the screen. There is a middle button that looks
called share
that has an arrow in it. You press that.
I know, but it's blocking me at the minute.
So
what I'm going to do, Doug, I'm going to post it in the Facebook chat with our stuff.
Okay,
and
great.
you're gonna get that, and I'm gonna then describe how subversive this this scene is.
One thing, a theme in Star Trek that I think is interesting, that this kind of brings up, and I don't know if like Doug, as a veteran of the Trekiverse, notices that one of the ways that humans are described, though, are as this striving people, like as a striving, active, virile people who are peaceful. They're not warlike. They've transcended that, but definitely that notion of sort of masculine energy. I mean, I know they totally cucked it up, and it's now, it's boldly go where no man has gone before is out, and it's all like about like,
I think it's now
people.
boldly go where no
one has gone before.
Oh, is that? I thought it was no social justice warrior has gone before. All right, so
no he, she, or z has gone before.
That's right.
Come on, guys, give them.
Sure.
All right, here we go. This is the shot that Alfie wanted to show.
I think this is really like David Lynchian. Look at this shot. I mean, you've got the dead man on the really low in the shot at the bottom, and then that you just see the head of the injured guy, and then this incredible male gaze picture of a woman whose lower chin is visible at the top, and the body of woman as enemy, and so on. This is a remarkable artistic shot, like given the set they had. And I would say, here we're looking at something deliberately subversive. And maybe you're right, Doug. Perhaps the camera does things the, author's intentions weren't going for. But I think
Djene said
a unique shot.
Yeah, well, but I think that also you've got to put this in the context of the story, right? At this point, we're not meant to know the true character of this man-trap woman, which we discover later on. So we can't be shown her face, which is transformed at this point from the beauty that it is in many
So she's like a kind of siren, like a siren figure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. She's a salt monster in the in the reality of the show. She absorbs your salt, I think. But there's certainly, I mean, to really do justice to this sort of cinematographic analysis of shot by shot, analysis to discover the intentionality of the filmmakers or the TV producers, we'd have to know what the grammar was normally for these kinds of programs and what kinds of shots were standardized, what the demands were of the genre and then we'd have to know a little bit about who was behind the camera, and what other work they'd done, and then we might also try to think about how different genres make different demands and are differently situated in terms of their relationship to norms of society, like gothic tales and monster stories, and they're I think maybe subversive from the word go. They are looking at the aspects of society that we're not want to look at. So they're going to produce maybe images like this one, where the normal understanding and view of a woman is twisted around, and the horror of their body is revealed for what it really is, guys.
Their bodies are.
There's Terry Garr again.
Oh, that's just awful.
Well, I think like one of the interesting things about Star Trek also is, it is like a progressive TV show. Like it's like a self-consciously progressive TV show, and it's presenting this kind of progressive vision of the future. I don't think in the original series, and Doug might correct me, I don't think the communist utopia is fully established in the original series. I think the communist utopia really is a next generation sort of version. And Next Generation has continuity. Gene Roddenberry was involved in the creation of Next Generation, and it's explicitly a communistic future where humans have like surpassed their need for money, and they make jokes about it. I think it's not that apparent. It's yes, it's like a better society in the future, but it is very much a New Deal, like liberal. It's New Deal liberalism, right? In a very progressive sense, and in a kind of pacifistic way. They have a black woman, and Martin Luther King, believed that she what's his name? Nicole
Kidman. No, Nichelle Nichols.
Michelle Nichols. Yeah, Michelle Nichols was. She was told by Martin Luther King that
Nichelle Nichols. It's an N.
She was one of the most important people on TV because she was a black woman playing like not a maid or a slave or anything like that, but playing like a professional person. You had them bring the Russians, I believe, and this may be a myth. I'm not sure, but the Russians apparently mocked Star Trek because they were like, oh, there's no Russians in the future, and then they bring on a Russian character. So there's this kind of progressive multiculturalism that for the 60s was pretty progressive. Obviously, some of the gender stuff in Star Trek Next Generation is a bit iffy by today's standards. There's a whole episode in Next Generation where there's like this sex doll slave who is going to be given over to an enemy people to create peace. And the special trick they have is that the sex doll woman imprints on the person and loves them till they're deaf. But this woman meets Picard, and Picard is like so alpha and so good at duty that she's like, I'm going to imprint on you, and then I'm going to do this other guy, and I'm going to feel the duty because I'm so impressed by it. This is a lot of iffy gender stuff by today's standards.
But this is the episode that revealed that Picard was gay. Because he did not go to bed with this woman.
No, Picard wasn't gay. Picard was so beyond... Because Picard was hooking up with Beverly Crusher on the sly, and probably is Wesley Crusher's father.
You've been reading the fan fiction.
Where is Wesley Crusher's father? And there's a whole episode where Q takes him back in time, and instead of hooking up with a MILF, like an older woman in the academy, he's like very polite to her, and then he comes back to the future, and his whole career is lame, and he just works in he's just like a science officer instead of the captain because he didn't like hook up with an older woman in a bar when he was in the there's a lot of iffy stuff like that. But
I don't think that's iffy. That's like legit, man. But the point is,
Picard's a better captain. He doesn't need to hook up with aliens like Kirk. That's what Riker's for. Riker takes all the STDs for the Enterprise.
He hooks up with Riker on the regular, is what you're telling me? That boring.
Probably. I mean, the subtext of Next Generation is that they're all fucking. Like that's the subtext.
All right.
That's why
you're right.
That's the subtext of it. But the communist future is from Next Generation.
I want to say that it's mixed up. I think that in the original series, it's uneven. There are moments where some sort of utopia, whether it's socialist or communist is not clear. I mean, at the time it was the Cold War, so it was less likely to be overtly, saying things like there's no more money and everything's shared and it's not probably going to be in the foreground. But there was a hints that they didn't have money, I believe, but that was uneven. And so was the view of women in the original series. It would fluctuate from writer to writer, and they would hire different science fiction writers who were working for the pulps at the time to write episodes. Like Harlan Ellison wrote a really good episode called City on the Edge of Forever. And it was on the Edge of Tomorrow. Yeah. And Forever? I think it was City on the Edge of Forever. But I might be producing that, thinking of the Doctor Who episode. And yeah, no, it's a City on the Edge of Forever. I was right. Google helped.
Yeah, you were right. You were right.
And then a guy named David Gerald wrote a really good episode, which is famous and everyone knows, called The Trouble with Tribbles. He is a science fiction writer who wrote a fun book, a gay book called The Man Who Folded Himself, about a man who is time traveling so much that there are multiple versions of himself throughout time, and he becomes his own lover at a certain point.
That's pretty based. I mean, but that's because the genre is quite different. Like, it's an anthology genre. There's no canon. It's Star Trek is a vehicle to tell sci-fi stories, as opposed to, like, even when you get to Next Generation, where there is, like, you have a showrunner. You have different people writing different episodes, but it's there seems to be more of a thread going through it, whereas Star Trek is just this canvas that different artists can interpret in different ways. Hence, you have this great unevenness in it. But it was always inverted commas woke. I mean, like, now, the new Star Trek Discovery is like liquid woke, but it's like, and it's brilliant. The best part of the new Star Trek, like, the new Star Trek is terrible, but the best part is that it absolutely triggers the right people, because the future is basically what all these right wingers are terrified. The only white men in any position of authority are two homosexuals, and there's all these there's the gender neutral character, and then there's, like, a black woman in charge, of course, because this is America. So, like, all the white males are basically subordinated to the sexual and ethnic minorities, which is, like, super funny, because obviously that's triggering for certain people.
What's
but it was always pushing. I mean, they did, like, an interracial kiss in the 60s?
Yeah, the first interracial kiss was forced upon Uhura and Kirk by telepathic or telekinetic.
Boys, I'm not sure if you lads are on the right track with the wokeness of Star Trek. I have to say,
okay.
I don't think that.
Yeah, I'm going to give him the full screen here. Go.
Oh, right. Right. So I'm off now. Okay. I don't think that the first interracial kiss is a reason to celebrate Star Trek. But I wanted to get onto what Djene was saying about the phrase Djene was using, by today's standards, and I thought that there was something interesting going on in that. When I watched this, as you guys know, I've watched this for the first time today, and I thought that by today's standards, this was actually quite woke and fine, basically, legitimate in terms of liberals' ideology and liberal mindset. So I thought that, I don't think there's a progress going on with, like, the question of standards. What might be more interesting to say about the early Star Trek stuff is it's, like, woker than contemporary liberal wokeness. That is an argument I'd maybe be interested in. And I don't think that, there is, I think one thing we might be able to say about it is that, looking at that, what is it, 66? It's possible that the question of gender and sexuality in 66 was healthier than it is today. That would be maybe also something interesting to say about the way Star Trek has spanned. So when Djene was talking about the subsequent things, I was also thinking it sounds like it got worse. It sounds like that they did not awaken, but ended up worse. So there you go. That's my provocative point.
I award you Terry Garr. So
I don't think. I think you're onto something there, Alfie, about it. It's not necessarily better, in the sense that I guess in 1966, this stuff was, like it was like really difficult for black people. There was like literally you're in like parts of the country were like South Rhodesia, right? And women, were only coming into the workforce new. Liberal, cultural liberalism nowadays in America, at least in media institutions, is the hegemonic ideology. So in a certain way, the new Star Trek, even though it's woke, what it means to be woke has changed, because now it becomes a kind of I mean, I don't like the phrase, but a virtue signal of liberalism without content, where it's like paint by numbers, where instead of having where you have I don't know how to say, where it becomes like Bridgerton, if you know Bridgerton. I don't know if you know about Bridgerton.
Right.
Like Bridgerton is absolute trash TV, but people justify it and say, oh, well, we want to have black people in a period drama. And it's like, well, what are you celebrating? Well, Bridgerton is basically European. It's basically the liberal fantasy of a ruling class.
That is great. That is a great point. And let me just say that's a great point. And that the structure of Bridgerton is colonialist, actually. And the fact that we're celebrated because the content involves black actors is ridiculous when the structure of the program is deeply embedded in an anti-black history. That is a good take.
It's like Hamilton. Hamilton is insane, where you have black people and Latinos playing all these roles of slave owners and singing like jackasses on the stage. And I was talking to someone I know. I said, imagine if we, instead of doing like the American Revolution, we did a musical about freaking Ayatollah Khomeini, and Ayatollah Khomeini was played by a lesbian woman, and we celebrated that. That's like ridiculous stuff.
That would be awesome, and it will happen next year for sure. That's what will be in our future. But I want to point out something about the difference between today's Star Trek and this original like pilot, The Cage, and also suggest that even though there was more of a struggle going on in 66 and real people were facing much worse conditions in 66, that doesn't mean that the media was dealing with it. Can you hear me? Am I need to?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So anyway, what about you, Djene? Can you hear me still? Because you said to check my.
Yeah, everything's fine. I was trying not to interrupt you by typing something in the chat, but typing something into that.
Too many people can hear you, I think, is the problem.
Oh, okay. All right. So here's the thing. back to what I was saying. Even though there was struggle going on, that may have actually meant that the media that was produced was a little bit better. Like The Cage, it's worth noting, starts with a captain who is exhausted. And he's not exhausted in the way that a captain who would be exhausted would be today. Today, the captain who was exhausted would be exhausted because of some outside force that had oppressed her, probably, and was unjustified. He was exhausted because he was trying to take responsibility for something that was very difficult, and he was finding it taxing. And his exhaustion wasn't to be celebrated, but it was a fact. And it was also in a moment where I think America was feeling, maybe despite all of its wealth, a bit exhausted after World War II. You're talking about a generation who had seen that war, and two others. The Vietnam War was just beginning. And so maybe there's a hint of white man's burden in Captain Pike's exhaustion as well. But, you're talking about, in the midst of the Cold War, a show about admittedly heroic captain who starts out questioning his own mission and wanting to step back from it, and needs to learn something about life and society in order to be revitalized by the end of the episode. I mean, that's one of the things that happens, right? Is that he is more committed to the 5-year mission at the end, after facing what he asked for at the beginning, which is a life of relaxation and personal fulfillment without strife or struggle, is offered to him after he asked for it in his fantasies at the beginning. So I think all of that should be, thought about when you evaluate both like today's Trek and yesterday's Trek. And I think that
it comes back to the theme though, which is like living in the past, right? There was a certain amount of dynamism to the original Star Trek, which again, I'm not a super big fan of the original Star Trek, but I see what people see in it, and I can understand what people saw in it in the 1970s. Next Generation, very rarely for a spin-off show, I think, offers something different. For example, you have Picard is a very different captain from Captain Kirk. He's like a thinker, a philosopher, a historian. He's definitely not a military guy. And I think that was a kind of like brave move, because it created a very different dynamic on the Enterprise and opened the door for a lot of really interesting science fiction stories. Then you have Deep Space Nine, where you have really a discussion of the aftermath of the Cold War, or the aftermath of the First World War taking place between, the oppressed and the oppressor. I always think of the Cardassians as the space Russians and the Bajorans as the space Poles, because they have like the super like hardcore religion. And there's like a lot of questions about what is it to be a god and those kind of things. I think where Star Trek begins to go down a bit is with Voyager and Enterprise. And I actually like Enterprise, but I think Enterprise is just like a fun, like week to week, like space opera. I think Voyager is just kind of lame, and there's no character development and it's boring. But the new Star Treks, I just seem to have completely, it just feels like a different show. It feels like I'm watching something in a Star Trek outfit. I'm watching it try to be on the edge of social progress. I'm watching it try to be, at the forefront of liberalism. But liberalism isn't the same thing as it was in the 60s. And the show is just a kind of attempt to retread the past without, they bring back concepts and people from like the original series for fan service. It feels very much to be like they're trying to create a Marvel Cinematic Universe for Star Trek, where they can do what Disney has done with Star Wars and like milk as much money out of this as they can, and it just creates a poorer story to work with. I think there can be good things. I think the Star Wars and Disney generally murders everything it does, but occasionally something good like The Mandalorian comes out. But and Star Trek, I enjoyed the little cartoon series that did the Lower Decks show. I thought was a little bit funny, but it seems to have lost dynamism because capitalism and these big studios and become more and more conservative, and so they're looking for safe bets, and nostalgia is something that sells.
I want to I give you the live long and prosper for that. Can you do that? Stefan can't even do it. Oh yeah, there you got it. The one thing that I'm going to mention is I agree with most of what you just said, Djene. Stefan, you've only seen The Cage, right? That's your entire experience of Star Trek.
No, I've seen episodes when I was much younger.
Yeah, right. So but you have to understand a couple things about The Cage. Is that, well, first of all, Kirk isn't in it. Actually, none of the main characters from the original series are really in it. Even though Spock is there, it's not the same character as Spock. So you should watch a couple of episodes with Kirk and Spock and McCoy to round out your education on this, because it is a different.
I wanted to ask, what's the principle of kind of intervention in Star Trek? Because obviously we were speaking earlier, I was trying to get it in then, but I didn't manage it, about kind of colonialism. And obviously, so they have Star Trek, they have this very advanced civilization, if it's humans do, that is. If it's the communist one of the latest theories, or even before, it's, this kind of, most of the people they encounter, they're often going to be more primitive. what's the principle of intervention that they have towards them? Is it like, we're meant to
Prime
be
directive,
you asked.
baby.
Yeah, it's called the Prime Directive. You are not to
I
interfere.
do something like this.
Yeah, you're not to.
Isn't that the one?
interfere
Doesn't that come from the Chicago gangster planet? Because somebody dropped a Chicago gangster like video to them, and then they became Chicago gangsters.
Yeah.
So they were like, "Oh, we never want to like interfere with
But they constantly break it, right?
What's that again?
But the whole series is about them breaking this Prime Directive, right?
Well, yeah, Kirk breaks it all the time, but only when it's necessary because they're so backwards and wrong. Otherwise, he wouldn't break it. Kirk constantly breaks the Prime Directive, but finds reasons to do so. In the Next Generation, Picard also consistently breaks the Prime Directive, but a few times doesn't. And whenever it would mean that maybe millions will die if he doesn't violate the Prime Directive, he will hold back. But if it's like, personally immoral what they're doing, then he'll violate it. Is how I feel that worked out. But because no, the Prime Directive is a real thing.
Doesn't have this at all. It's like a very kind of slightly like kind of global war on terror, end of history thing, where these American soldiers and the American military just constantly intervene in other planets and just make things better. And there's no principle like this at all.
Well, there's definitely an ambiguity in Star Trek. I mean, and this is really fleshed out in Deep Space Nine, because in Deep Space Nine, they're on a space station over a planet that's just undergone a big occupation. So there's a lot of questions about the Federation want these guys to join join their Federation? How far can they intervene to like get them to join the Federation? Then it's complicated that because Captain Sisko is also decreed by the wormhole aliens, who the Bajorans, these oppressed aliens, worship. He's proclaimed their emissary, so he's both the Federation's ambassador to the Bajorans, but also a religious figure that the religious hierarchy on Bajor doesn't really like. So you have this interesting sort of dynamic where there's all these different pressures on him about how to deal with these people, how to intervene but not intervene, and it makes it an interesting question and asks a lot of interesting questions. Like Sisko destroys the whole planet because the Federation had handed that planet over to the Cardassians, and those people were rebelling against the Cardassians, and he helps the Cardassians suppress them. So despite their intentions, the Federation is shown in certain contexts to be a colonial power. And you meet people throughout Deep Space Nine who are like, screw you, Federation. Why are you always trying to get into our stuff? Why are you always trying to make us like you? We want to do things our way. That theme is definitely in Next Generation. There's a whole episode where they go to a planet where there's a bunch of Native Americans who have settled on the planet, and they have to hand the planet over to the Cardassians.
Oh,
and Picard's like, well, we've made a treaty with the Cardassians. You have to leave. And they're like, what the fuck are you talking about? Why do we have to leave this planet? And then they all smoke some peyote, and Picard finds out his ancestor was a conquistador, and it's some crazy stuff. But colonialism is discussed. The Federation definitely behaves in colonial ways at times, but there is a reticence about it. There is a dynamic. I don't think that dynamic necessarily exists directly in the original series. It definitely doesn't exist in the movies, which kind of degenerate. I mean, the best Star Trek movie is the one where they go to San Francisco to get the whales, but
that's a good one.
That's a good one, but it just becomes like a space opera rather than anything discussing. But colonialism is touched on quite heavily in both Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, because it's like a big deal of how do you deal with civilizations that don't have the same technology as you, or how do you deal with civilizations that have social institutions that you find abhorrent? and can you intervene in them? And a lot of times it's like, well, no, we can't intervene with them because, that's the rules and we could make things worse. So there's definitely an interesting, which is different, of course, from SG-1, where everyone's a super Chad, right? And they're just going to make everything better where they go. The Enterprise crew generally does make things better when they intervene, but they're like not sure that it's always going to be the case. And there's some episodes where it goes wrong as well, where things don't turn out the way that they planned and they totally miscalculate their thing, and they get a good lesson about why they need to listen to the Prime Directive.
I think, Gene, one of the things in what you're saying there, Gene, that strikes me as important is that, like, at least that stuff's thought about. Why am I getting a big screen every time I talk?
Because you're not on enough, so I want everyone to realize that you're here.
Listen,
look, Alfie
has the best hair.
Look, I've got the best hair. Put me on the big screen. I just want to ask Gene.
You're like a sexy Paul Merton.
And thank you very much.
All right, now that's enough. You had a few moments. Now your time's up. Your cult.
No. Come on, I've got a point here.
Okay.
No, I think what's interesting, what Gene was saying, is that there was an engagement with these topics at this point. Like, yes, Star Trek clearly, to me, and Doug will also say maybe it wasn't deliberate. It clearly engages with colonialism, and I want to ask you guys, Gene, on the basis of what you said, and also Doug as a sci-fi writer, do you think science fiction has, which way do you think science fiction has gone since this point? Because I wouldn't say that science fiction does a good job. I mean, I'm interested in Chinese science fiction myself, really interested in Cixin Liu and Ken Liu. But apart from that, I feel like science fiction has drifted away from dealing with these kind of topics, like, looking at the relationship between colonialism and what it means to sort of go to a planet and colonize it and so on. And the question we were talking earlier about gender. So basically, we're all saying that, Star Trek has these kind of connections with thinking quite critically about colonialism, about gender politics, about sexuality. But science fiction since then, where's that gone? As a sci-fi writer, Doug, or Gene, in relation to your long histories of the world that you like to give?
I'll take a stab at it. I think that to the extent to which the original series dealt with colonialism, and I think it did, it did so in the service of other things. It was, if there were the kinds of episodes where Kirk and Spock and McCoy would visit at less advanced planets and intervene, but they would wrestle with how to intervene, or they would go and undo the intervention of some other Starfleet officer. But it was always in the service of sort of analyzing social problems and I would say philosophical problems or even scientific problems at times, although that was pretty rare. But the premise of the show was to kind of explore the contemporary world and, the U.S. culture through the metaphor of all these other planets and situations.
Right,
so,
yeah.
So that might very well raise, issues of colonialism, but it was not self-consciously done because, it was at a time where the problem of colonialism was not as dominant in the mainstream culture. It wasn't the way in which, the frame through which we viewed problems in society and thought about the injustices in the world. There were other different frames. There was a lot of anti-communism in the original series, despite the fact that in the background there's sort of a communist utopia. There's an episode where a planet that's been infected by the Declaration of Independence has warring factions, and the Asian-looking faction are called the Coms, and the Aryan-looking faction is called the Yangs, and they are the ones who worship the Declaration of Independence, and Kirk has to set them right at the end and tell them that what they're really worshiping isn't a religious document, but one of the greatest documents of human freedom in all times.
Honky Tonk Sharia, as I like to call it.
Yeah. This is why you go to Gulag after the revolution, Gene. So
you think you'll be sending people to the Gulag?
Yeah, well, it depends on
who
which
has
faction
the bigger mustache.
Oh, well, that may be true.
Gene.
That may be true.
On Gene's moustache, I have to. The other day, Gene, if you were in a meeting the other day, Gene's moustache was just looking so good. I mean, it's just,
Yeah,
you know,
pretty
you've
good.
you've not done it quite right now, Gene, but it is a
I need to get the-
phenomenal.
I
I
need to get the
think
ends up.
it's the whole beard mustache thing is very strong, very, very strong right now.
I want to suggest in the next episode that we pick up what developed out of T.J. Hooker. Maybe look at the original pilot for.
I'm not watching TJ Hooker. Get out
What?
of here.
What? All right.
I'm not watching.
So
I do want to make a comment on Alfie's thing. I think I think Doug is totally right that a lot of this colonial stuff it's kind of in passing. Although there are interesting things. They have an African doctor on the ship, in this like utopia and future. Now, when we get to Star Trek Next Generation, there is definitely a shift over the seven seasons in dealing with colonialism. Like in the first season, there's an episode called Code of Honor where they basically go to black people planet, and the black people on the planet won't take some medicine or something. And I can't remember exactly what happens, but it's like doing it's like Planet Wakanda. It's like really quite bad, and it becomes a little bit more sophisticated. But I think there are sci-fi novels and shows that are talking about colonialism, although I still think they're coming from a fundamentally liberal perspective. I think about Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy. I think that's an interesting discussion of the colonization of Mars and the political implications of it and the kind of society that emerges on it and the kind of the relationship that it has with Earth as the society, which is much more communistic than Earth, matures over time. And I think the Expanse series of novels, which are kind of an interesting halfway point between a space opera and a kind of more serious, inverted commas, sci-fi, deals a lot with the issue of colonialism, because you have the inner planets, which are Earth and Mars, exploiting the Belters, who are this like brutally oppressed people who live in the asteroid belt and in the planet's outer system, who are being seen.
My Russian communist friend had a very different interpretation of the Expanse to you. He thinks the Belters basically, I mean, they should have, they deserve genocide basically.
Oh, he thinks they should deserve. Well, the point is that they will be. I think they represent, at least in the minds of the authors, these kind of like you have like they're like anarchists. Like Mars is more like a socialist project trying to like terraform a planet and mobilize people in the good old fashioned top down method, whereas you have this like mass of people who are seen as like an inferior race by people on in other parts of the solar system. And they're like brutally oppressed by capitalist structures. But the solution that they come to in the end is like not like a socialist revolution, but rather, we'll give those people a slice of the capitalist pie. We'll let them drive the spaceships, and they can take money that way. So there's a lot of points where they get close to something really interesting in the Expanse, like the bad guy leader of the rebels, who wants to like throw asteroids at Earth to tell them to fuck off out of space. He basically says, we're the Afghans of the universe. I don't think they say it in the TV series, but they say it in the novel. He says, we are the inheritors of the Afghans. You can try and come and conquer us, but you'll come back in your graves. And so there's this like very strong third world versus the core, where people don't give a shit about these people, but they're benefiting from all the economic products that they're getting. There is that discussion of that sort of world, that unfair division of labor between these two groups. But then the solutions lie in having a good politician like Avasarala, who comes out of the political establishment but has a good heart, and like some good military officers and some belters, and then they just work it all out and set up their own sort of fairer capitalist system where everybody gets a slice of the pie. So I think it's a kind of interesting discussion on corporate power and imperialism, but it comes to a very liberal kind of conclusion.
I want to share something with you guys for a moment.
Is it Terry? Is it Terry again?
Why are you playing that treacherous nonsense to us?
I was trying to counter your lack of devotion to the basic notions of bourgeois liberty, which we have to sublate rather than abandon. And I thought that if I myself was not eloquent enough to put it a good argument up to against your position, cynical as it is, that the acting stylings of William Shatner in the original series of Star Trek would be an adequate counter. And also, I wanted to show a couple of minutes of his of the silliness of the original series on the.
I think it's pretty good.
Stream. Yeah.
Yes, and wear sunscreen also.
Yeah. What? Are you saying that because these people look sunburned, or are you saying that just because
he looked blacked up?
Yes, because they looked blacked up and sunburned, and because of Shatner's wear sunscreen, single.
Oh, I don't think he did the wear sunscreen thing.
Yes, he
I don't
did.
think that was Shatner.
Yes, he
no.
did.
No, that wasn't Shatner. Nah, we have a battle.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
I'm glad that we have editing, so I don't have to feel like
Do we?
Oh, this is all going in, Stefan.
No,
it was. It is William Shatner saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, wear sunscreen. If I could offer you one piece of advice, that is what Shatner."
There was a song called "Everybody's Free to Wear Sunscreen."
Yeah. Yes, and that is David Byrne and Will Shatner's the voiceover saying, you got to wear sunscreen. So, come on. My joke had many levels.
Okay, I didn't know that it was Shatner. I'm skeptical nonetheless still, but
you're not skeptical. You're wrong. You're skeptical as much as
I'm skeptical, and I could be wrong to be skeptical.
Yeah, both possible. Okay. It is for sure William Shatner who does the voiceover on that song.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And Baz Luhrmann did the song, didn't he?
I will find out. I'll verify that, and I'll put the correct answer.
Oh, patrons get the truth, everybody.
No.
Say every week.
What are we going to do next time, guys? What?
Well, can you? Great question, Gene. Can you tell me what this? Because this is my first appearance. What is this bloody show?
Well, it's called Culture Deconstructed, and every week
we blather about sci-fi.
Every couple of weeks, we talk about some bit of pop culture, usually science fiction.
Can we do Silent Running?
Stefan is the gatekeeper here. Stefan is like, no, you have to be relevant.
I'm saying that we should now do one. We've done one that isn't in the news or whatever. Wasn't one that hasn't come out recently. And so next time we can do something completely irrelevant and shit that no one's ever heard of. So you guys can fight over which boring old thing you want us to watch.
Let's do Ursula Le Guin's Lathe of Heaven. Okay, Silent Running.
No, okay. My vote's Silent Running. But
I've said for a few episodes I say at the end like, oh, people should comment what they want to see. But obviously I don't think anyone watches the full hour and 10 minutes and then leaves a comment, or very few people do. So I think if we do that,
one person does.
Somebody said do Babylon 5.
Yeah.
I forgot.
Yeah.
If one person comments, we should do what they say. So if you have listened for this long, we'll do whatever you say next week.
Yeah. But no, we will talk about whatever you tell us to talk about. We won't do whatever you say.
Right.
We're not programmed like that.
We're not, like the funky chicken from that old Domino's ad or whatever. All right. What were you going to say, Gene, to sign us off?
Live long and prosper.
Yes, we can.
All right. Yes, we can. Everyone do this. Alfie. Yes, Alfie can't do it. Oh, Alfie. No, wrong fingers. There you go. All right. Nicely done. Oh, cool. All right. Manning the stream.